my immediate right. Debating on the motion that this House supports athletes making political and religious expressions at international sporting events, I'd like to invite Gary to begin the debate. I'll be timing with my phone, so you're going to hear the sound when it's 1, 6, and 7. Okay, when you're ready.
It is extremely regretful these athletes, as a powerful and influential figure, are denied their voices in terms of expression in these international sporting events. Why did I say so? We draw correlations and examples towards what happened recently in the NFL when Hussein Abdullah was given a foul after he went to express a form of prayer after a touchdown. I think that's something regretful given other practices, other NFL players and NBA players such as Jeremy Lin do crosses signs of praise towards the God before entering the games, right? We think this form of religious, there should be a form of equality in terms of religious expression and how these voices of these athletes should be transcended. I'll do two things in this debate today. Firstly, I'll talk to you why these athletes deserve a right to voice out in terms of freedom of expression, and secondly, I'll talk to you about how it transcends international discourse, and lastly, I'll tell you why how it is an equal platform for all religions to play a part in society and cause an influential role. And lastly, my second speaker will come out and tell you how this is still okay and it does not affect the spirit of the game and how this is better for the people in the public. Sit down. So firstly, let's move on to talk about athletes and their rights, right? First, you have to consider these athletes are already public figures, people that have influence society. They have social media accounts, they Facebook, Twitters, and they spread the things that they talk about are being spread right around the sphere of social media, where people retweet, where people reply, and people read opinions that these people give, right? Given that it's already present in status quo that these athletes and these international sport members already have a voice in society and how it's already the status quo that they are spreading it in terms of social medias, we don't think they deserve to be denied a voice in terms of playing participation in these international games. We think when the cyclist from Malaysia is denied when he wore a glove that says "Save Gaza" in the games in Commonwealth. We think that's something that when the officials tried to penalize him for his actions, we think that's something harmful, and we don't think that's fairly treated towards people like him. Given that these figures, these athletes have their social role in society where they impact people in terms of what they say, and there are people who we confront to, and we people that we refer as models, and people that we want to listen to because they already become a representative of the state. But then again, we don't think a side opposition should come up that because they are representative of a certain state, then there will be a representation of that sound coming from the state, right? Because we think people are motivated by different forms of things in life. They can be motivated by love for the family, they can be motivated by love for the country, people are motivated by different forms of motivation, such as a love for their own religion and how they want to pursue more depth into their religion in terms of how they express a certain fight for that certain religion in a certain international sporting event. So we think if they want to draw lines between an athlete voicing out will be a representation of that state, its voice, we don't think that's fair for side of government to defend. But before I move on, sure.
Sir, do you agree that there is a difference between your personal life and also your professional life?
Yes, sir. We think there's a huge distinctive where I already draw a lot of parallels where people are motivated by different things, and how when you are participating in a professional event, you're okay to provide your different views, and because as long as it doesn't affect the game, right? Because your views doesn't actually contract with what happens in the game later, right? Because that's something Charlene will come out and tell you in this debate. We think given that it's already present in status quo, we think we should allow them and support them to voice out in these international events and give their opinions. And even if they are politically wrong or religiously right, we think there's already lawsuits or it is a natural check and balance where people can already sue these people for a wrong form of information or even defamation if that's so, right. So we think it's fair and it's already condemnable if they do something that's politically incorrect. But let's move on to second thing, right? We talk about how it transcends international discourse, right? Because we think in certain countries there are events or there are partakings of a certain commotion that's not really known in the international sphere, right? Because there are certain things that the government tries to hide from people and tries not to publicize. This is when how these people, these international athletes can kick in and provide personal views if they condemn their own government stance or things like that, right? And eventually, if the government comes in and want to like penalize them for certain things, certain things that they say, we think it's fair for these people if that the things that they said are facts, that are factually correct, because then they can't deny that voice, and even if the government wants to condemn them, we think they deserve a right to seek for refugee in other countries where the facts that they provide are politically correct. Why is this form of international discourse important? Two things. We think firstly, it garners international support where the form of information given are harmful to that country, and how international support can always sanction or provide different alternatives to counter the commotion that's happening in that certain country. Right? I think that's something that's important because in certain places, where things happen without others knowing, we think international participation or international intervention are required for these things to come to a better solution. We think it's given that these people fight for pride, they represent the country, they deserve, and the people come to them, and people praise them and worship them in terms of how they perform. We think they have a right to know how much how much their personal views are, and in terms of depth of their personal views, and which person they adore to, and things like that, right? We think in terms of religion also, we think people deserve to know what form of religion this athlete conforms to, and things like that, right? And lastly, I'll talk to you about how certain agendas in society needs more attention, given that I did draw that these people can garner more international support. We draw to you the oppression of athletes in the Sochi Games, where the LGBT athletes are treated differently. We think it's something that where international discourse was created, where people actually came in, how three societies, the All Out, the Athlete Ally, and Human Rights Watch, lobbied against the Olympics International Committee to introduce Policy 6, which is an anti-discrimination law. We think it's fair to say that we want equal rights for these people, not to be oppressed when they are performing for their country, not let them to be able to perform or self-actualize themselves in terms of their performance in their sports, right? We don't want them to feel oppressed like these LGBT athletes in the Sochi Games. That's something very regretful. So, does it take away the spirit of the game? We don't think so. We think to a certain extent, it might affect some fans' views in terms of how they want to view it, but we don't think it's unfair for them to voice it out, because there's already natural check and balances, and Charlene will talk to you more about it. In terms of equality, in terms of religion, we think when other religions or other athletes can perform any forms of actions regarding to their religions, we don't think we can deny other religions from performing whatever forms of actions they want to. We think the burden of proof coming from opposition is they have to prove to us why these players or athletes don't deserve a voice in these international events. Here.
Thank you. Chandy, please.
Here.
We think that when athletes are allowed to publicly propagate by saying that Daoyu Island belongs to China, democracy is the best form of political system, or Christianity is the purest religion in the world, we think this is problematic, especially in an international arena, because it induces conflict, because it reduces the quality of sports, and this is greatly beyond and against the nature of sports to begin with. The premise coming from opening government based on two things. Firstly, they think people have, especially athletes, should have the freedom of speech because of the influence and because of the massive accessibility of public, right? We think our stance has to be made clear. We are not banning them from saying from having freedom of speech, but the problem is to what extent should that freedom of speech be allowed to them? We think it's fine for them to tweet it in social media, on Facebook or whatsoever, but the problem is in this context, in an international sports event, this is problematic, and I'm going to explain to you why this induces conflict and how it's harmful to the sports itself, right? Secondly, they also talk about discourse, public discourse is important. We agree to the idea that this public discourse is important, but whether a fair public discourse is achieved is questionable in this debate, and I'm going to explain to you why by different athletes having different representation of different nations and different power of different nations, and whether you perform well and whether you're famous in that sport never allows you to have a fair discourse to begin with. And whether international arenas should be used to a means to an end of public discourse is highly questionable, and I'm going to deal with it or in my argument. Before I move on, closing, yeah.
The Olympic Games was started up as a platform for countries to be able to understand each other better on an international platform. Given that religious and political expressions are all part of understanding another person, what's wrong with that?
We agree to the idea that sports is somehow fostering peace and cooperation among countries. When we are seeing that once there's controversial issues and controversial political system and conflicts are ongoing, having international sport, which is have a high media exposure, and the fans in that sport are highly emotional and highly sentimental, this shouldn't be used to a means to foster your peace, because this is not going to be achieved anyway, right? Firstly, let's talk about the nature of sports, in general, right? We think when an athlete is participating in an international arena, you only know two things about the athletes. Firstly, it's about what kind of sport is he playing, and secondly, it's about what kind of nation is he representing. We think these are only two features that recognize and define an athlete in an international arena. We think the very reason that we don't include political background, your cultural background, and your religious background, because these are some ideologies that are controversial and people are supporting different types of ideologies. We want to minimize such difference is because we want sports to be purely sport, which is about challenging yourself, being better to fight and whatsoever. We think sports and international sports should not be used as a means for a battlefield of different types of ideologies and different types of religious beliefs. We think this affects the quality of sport, and I'm going to tell you in my further substantive. Secondly, I'm going to tell you more specific, why is it induce conflict and why is it harmful to the quality of sport on a practical level, right? On a practical level. On a practical level. Firstly, about how it induces conflict. We think in an international sport arena, you need to understand the psychology of audiences and the psychology of media and whatsoever. These audiences, they already, international sport is where a place nationalism is highly emphasized in the sport, and those people who are watching sport is highly sentimental and highly emotional, and more likely they're having an antagonistic manner towards the opponents itself. We think, especially given the condition that these people's emotions are that unstable and they're very highly sentimental, it is where irrational behavior may take place, especially given that the sport, the athlete is openly supporting a certain type of view and openly propagating any ideology and whatsoever. We think it is where violence is going to take place, especially given that you're very emotional, you are very antagonistic towards another nation or whatsoever, right? We think when you're having differences being emphasized and different types of ideology that you're being propagated here, we think those people is more likely for them to further antagonize and violence may occur, and this is something that we want to minimize in our house, right? We think it's very unfair for them to use a sport, using these people, this violence as a means to an end ultimately, which is not which is not 100% guarantee, even if, right? Secondly, we also talk about guarantee of sport. They talk about quality of sport is not being compromised under their case, check and balance will occur anyway, right? We think in a sports arena, international sport arena such as Olympics, such as World Cup, whatsoever, you are more likely, not more likely, you're representing a nation, you're no longer an individual athlete participating in that sport because it is international, it is on a national level, on an international level, right? We think is when an athlete, they are very ideologically saying that an athlete, it is not necessary for you to represent the ideologies of your country. Imagine whether an US athlete is allowed to say democracy is the worst form of political system and we support communism. We think that when you're representing a nation, there will be a lot of coercion and a lot of pressure coming from your nation because you're representing that nation on that international arena. We think when you're When you're participating in such kind of sports, you're no longer an individual who are free from any identity because you are the one who consent to the nation to represent them, when we also think the country is powerful enough to make you be coerced to propagate their ideology and whatsoever. There are only two choices. Either you are coerced and say something, either you're coerced to say something in accordance with your country's ideology. This doesn't allow a check and balance or a fair ground of discourse, because for more powerful countries such as the United States, such as big countries such as China, it is more likely for those athletes' ideologies to be propagated, and small countries or Middle East countries or smaller countries who has less political influence is never able to get their voice being heard because they have less good athletes and less famous athletes. And the second choice for those athletes is that you're being coerced to not participate in such tournament or such international event simply because you're not in accordance with the ideology of your country. We think this harms the quality of sports when those athletes cannot freely opt in to join such sport, and we think this is very harmful on an international arena. We are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene.
Here.
Politicians, celebrities, they all have the same freedom to express their views in their line of work. They support certain causes, they condemn certain issues. We believe that the same freedom of expression should be allowed for athletes as well. We see that in status quo, right? These athletes, they already do endorse certain brands, they become a form of advertisements to certain companies, right? We see that it's far more beneficial if these athletes, they support their own ideologies, they propagate certain ideologies and ideals. That's far more better compared when status quo already allows these sort of endorsements of different brands, right? We see that there's no difference compared to supporting different ideologies. We believe that it further extends the discourse that the international society is able to discuss within the status quo, right? We find that even if it's I'll do to you two things today. I'll prove to you that it does not affect the gamesmanship, and second of all, we don't believe that it will extreme views would distort this discourse, and third of all, I'll prove to you how fair discourse will still be present, and her entire line of argumentation was about how conflicts will arise and how these people are sentimental and aggressive, especially when you're watching sports, right? Legally, right, you're not allowed to attack these sportsmen in the first place. We believe that there are already laws that can balance that kind of oppression of violence that might happen. Right? We believe that there's a natural deterrence to prevent all this kind of violence that might happen under their paradigm. But we said even in status quo, right, politicians and celebrities, they always have this kind of freedom to express their views, right, even in their own line of work. We believe that these sportsmen, it's no different from this. When you talk about how nations would put pressure on certain sportsmen to endorse certain views, right, we believe that that's highly ideological, even if these people are representing their nations, right. The final say is still from the sportsmen themselves. They get to decide what brand they get to endorse, what kind of companies, what kind of products they get to display on the shirts, right? We see that even if a country has a certain view, these individuals' views will ultimately be the one that they choose to propagate at the end of the day, right? So we see. I'll talk to you on how, first of all, it's important for discourse to happen, even if there are extremist views that are propagated by these people, right? We see that kind of condemnation is extremely important for discourse to happen. Even we find that kind of narrative is important because when you have strong ideologies such as jihadist, ISIS, the ISIS nature of brainwash coming out of the society. Right? Even if these people they propagate all these ideas, we see that international condemnation on these ideologies, that is extremely important because it reaches a far wider audience that this message is extremely bad. So it's extremely important for this kind of international condemnation to happen on all these extremely negative ideologies, right? That's how we stifle extremist ideologies. That's how we prevent people from being extremists. We find that there are natural check and balance. I'll extend more on that because of how these athletes, they will naturally be more incentivized to keep their own fan base, right? They will not propagate that kind of extremist views that is extremely harmful to society. And furthermore, when there's international condemnation, right, that balances out the extremist views, right? And we see that in the Incheon Games, right? Certain players were banned from entering Korea. There were 7 Malaysians, 1 Singaporeans, because they support extremist religious views. Right? We believe that that kind of actions disincentivize these sportsmen from propagating extremist views. So we find that political manipulation would not it's ultimately still up to the sportsmen themselves, and we don't believe that any form of manipulation can occur. Let's look on the second thing before I move on to analyzing the fans' reaction to all these messages. Yes.
Why is it not coercive under a soft house when the athlete is never able to express his view freely simply because it's a representation of the nation?
That's not true, right? We see that in status quo. Does the nations choose what brand you choose to advertise on your shirts? What kind of gloves you wear? What kind of shoes you wear? All these are the decisions of the sportsmen themselves, right? We see different sports players from different countries. They wear different brands of shoes because they advocate for that brand, right? We see that it's ultimately, at the end of the day, still the decision of the sports players, even if they are representing countries. So onto my second analysis on fans' reactions, right? Even if these players are culpable, we believe that the first intention of them was to support the skills and not their ideologies. The first thing that attracts these people, that won't change, that won't affect these people extremely negatively, is that the first thing that are attracted to is always their ability, right? We find that if most of these people are rational enough to deal with these ideologies, right? Even if they are not, even if they are irrational and easily attracted by sensational issues, we believe that international condemnation, that is extremely important to all these irrational people, right? It's important for these people to realize how harmful certain ideologies are. That kind of discourse will affect these people especially, and we need these people who are on the middle ground or are extremely unsure of what kind of ideologies is right or wrong. It is extremely important for these people to be exposed to all these different views. And on the third problem on whether it affects the games or not, we see that it does not take away the spirit of the game, because apart from status quo, when ads are already present, we find that apart from games, right, in interviews, they always propagate certain ideologies. They always talk about their own beliefs and their own opinions. We see that even in that international arena, that international platform, is far more beneficial for them to propagate their views even more, right? So it does not affect gamesmanship, because their ultimate goal is to go there and compete, not to spread those ideologies. The games will be affected because on how they will always want to perform the best to attract more popularity. They will always want to be the best compared to other people. So that's how gamesmanship will not be affected. We see that these people, regardless of their impact on society, they should have that kind of freedom to express. They should have the freedom to talk about whatever they want. The same like any other people of any other profession, they have the same right to expression. We are proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, David, please.
Mr. Speaker, on the side of opposition, we don't think that sports, the nature of sports should be connected to any kind of political views or as well as religious views. Because even if they say that, well, they have freedom of expression, but as what Jenny has been telling you, right, we say even if they does express, we don't think that it is often their personal view, but more than that, they are, because of the fact that they are somehow representing their nation, and what they are going to say is somehow being representative to their national view as well. So that's why we think that the kind of freedom of expression can never be achieved. But what they are going to allow is that they are going to celebrate the kind of coercion that is going to be imposed upon the athletes as well. But more than that, they talk about, well, we need the mutual understanding. So my substantive would be that we would like to prove to you why you allow this kind of athletes to publicly express in the particular situation in the international events will actually harm the public discourse, and it will also block the mutual understanding of two nations and two peoples in two nations as well. Before I move on, 3 rebuttals. Firstly, they talk about, well, they try to address the idea of the violence within the sports event. They say that, well, we are going to punish them. But the point is, what we are trying to do is we are trying to proactively prevent the violence from occurring to begin with. We think that it is much better because, firstly, when we talk about the nature of the audience, we think that their purpose should be purely go to the competition and go to watch the competition and appreciate the athletes, instead of having any kind of political view that will be infringed upon their rationality and their rational thinking as well. But secondly, when talking about the nature of understanding, we believe that for different nations, we say that different nations actually have different kinds of faults and have different kinds of advantages as well as disadvantages politically or whatever. But the point is, we say that the understanding is about appreciation. We don't think that any kind of unfair public discourse will block this kind of appreciation, will be a better way for them to express their view. But secondly, they also talk about, like, well, even if they have the extreme views, then it should be allowed. But we have 3 responses about this. We say that when you talk about athletes, not only they are doing the sports individually, but also they have some kind of linkage with the fans, right? That's why they have the fan base. That's why they have the they have the fan base which are extremely loyal to them. But what we are going to say is, because of the fact that when the fans go to watch their athletes to compete, we say that most of the time it is based on the personal cult of that particular athletes. So that's why what they are trying to believe is that it is very likely the case that the kind of fans will actually follow what is believed in by their athletes, instead of having any kind of critical thinking as well as rational thinking. But secondly, when you're talking about nature of freedom of speech, we think that freedom of expression should be about a kind of spectrum, instead of having two groups of radical people, Mr. Speaker. But what we are trying to allow is that you are allowed this kind of two radical individuals from to appear. And this is because firstly, what they are believing is simply based on the personal cult instead of their rational thinking. And secondly, we also say that in the particular sport events, in the international sport events, we say that when they are going to watch the film, watch the competitions, we say they are very likely being emotional led instead of being peaceful or being quite especially. So we think that we have to take this kind of sentiment into account, Mr. Speaker. So that's why we don't think that you're actually producing a group of people who are rational. Instead, you are trying to exaggerate the differences. But more than that, we say that it is not only about athletes and the fans as well. It's also about media, how they are going to portray what they are going to say, or what the athletes are going to say, right? When the media are going to portray the kind of the things that the athletes are saying, we say that it will also lead to unfair public discourse within that nation, Mr. Speaker. So that's why we think that nationals are being when the nationals are being affected because of this because of the role model effect that is perpetrated by the athletes. We don't think it is a good approach, because within that nation you only have one voice ultimately. Before I move on, yes.
In all these sportsmen, right, you already have social media to propagate all these different views, right? The country does not censor all these views. it's these kind of views that allow for proper discourse, which you are hampering.
No, even if you say that, well, there are different media, but what we are going to say is because of the media, they want to gain the attraction, and they are, a lot of them are always like the profit oriented, right? That's why they want to get the material that is the most attractive, and the most attractive material will be always related to the sports as well. So that's why we say that even if you have another media, we don't think it is effective in terms of countering the voice that is provided by the athletes. But more than that, why we think that it blocks the understanding? As my partner Jenny has already told you, right? Sports is about the mutual understanding as well as to minimize the differences amongst the nations. Why we think that on their paradigm they harm this principle? Because firstly, we have to understand the atmosphere of the sport events itself. We say it is highly, as I have already mentioned, they are highly emotional and highly sentimental, and they are somehow their emotion is somehow be led by the intense atmosphere of that competition. And secondly, we also say the audience have actually the loyalty to that particular athletes as well. They go to watch the match. It is because of the personal cult. And thirdly, we also say that you also create two groups of people that are highly radicalized. Maybe originally, if you do not express your feels, the people go there will just watch the competitions and appreciate the athletes. But if you are going to if the athletes are going to express their feels, we think that it will become the kind of added values that is imposed on the fans' mindset. That's why when they we will also block the way for them to appreciate the different athletes in the different nation. They will somehow despise that particular athlete, not because the athletes is performing bad, but it is because the athletes, the nation that the athletes is representing is not democratic or is not humane or so far so forth. So that's why we think that you will also. So what I have tried to prove to you today, we have proved you why the unfair public discourse will be led, and why the kind of because of the atmosphere in that particular international events, the fans will not be rational, so far so forth. For all of these reasons, we are very proud of Post.
Thank you. To start the closing debate now, Natalie, please.
Yes. Here.
I'm going to do my speech slightly differently today and start with extensions before I move on to rebuttals. Because we see that the biggest problem with the opening house so far is that we really focus only on the athlete and the athlete's experiences. But we need to understand that how this debate really stands in a wider discourse on where religious freedoms and political expressions really stand within society, as well as the ongoing landscape of debate that is happening there. Two extensions for today. What is the point of public political and religious expressions? Secondly, what is the purpose of an international sporting arena and the role of athletes? Substantives and rebuttals, it's kind of amalgamated here as well. So what's the point of public political and religious expressions, right? Opposition seems to have the misconception that expression means evangelism. It means to push your views onto you. We think that this is blatantly a lie. Someone yelling "Thank God" at the end of a winning a match, for instance, is not a call for you to go join whichever church he is going to, right? We think that a lot of why people even want to ingrain these things is simply because it is absolutely impossible for you to divorce your racial, your political, and your religious expressions from your own self. This is something deeply ingrained in you, that which you just do, because this is something that is deeply part of you as a person. We don't think there is any harm whatsoever in simply trying to express yourself under such circumstances, right? This is where closing opposition tried to bring a POI. Is there a difference between private and public lives? And this is where to understand that this is a false barrier. And more governments all around the world are starting to recognize that it is absolutely impossible, for instance, to divorce politics with religion, for instance. And this is why even secular states like the US is starting to realize more and more that their state is really a church-controlled state. But because that
refusal to discuss religion within public arenas, and the standing that religious expressions have amongst politicians, amongst people in society, you don't get very good transparent policies, you don't get very clear understandings of what the discourse and the landscape of your society really is like. But the second role of why we need to have these public and political expressions is because it's about mobilizing minorities within society, right? Because we think that what they do is that they just block any ability for any minority to express himself as a member in society. That's why when you ban someone from the NFL, someone who's representing you as an American from yelling like what was it, Alhamdulillah, Allah Akbar, something, I can't remember, sorry. Basically what you mean is that like you're basically blocking any ability for them to show themselves as part of the normal American landscape on TV, as part of basically that racial background and that religious background that your country is made out of, and is not dominated by simply white straight men. We also think the counterfactual here is that means this blocks any forms of religious expression on public television, which makes it absolutely impossible for minorities to gain any sort of real voice of normalization in society. Because whenever they try to raise issues of their own, when it comes to discourse of Glee or something, portraying you in a somewhat racist fashion, we think that always it turns out that you end up being the exception. You end up being someone making a big fuss over some racist remark that was led onto you, or you are basically like the token Muslim in a group. We think that when a person does somehow a public expression on TV and nobody says anything about it, you aren't showing yourself as a token Muslim. You're showing yourself as an accepted member of American society. This is something we're very happy to have. Go ahead.
At the very beginning of your speech, you say that the kind of the expression that athletes express will not have very strong effect, but then you also say that it is effective in terms of fighting minority rights. So what stands are going to
the effect I was talking about means that it's not an effect of us saying that it will force you to convert into Islam, right? It is simply about recognizing that there are enough these people within society, and Muslim people do exist in American society. Recognize that. So second point, what is the purpose of international sporting arena? And what is the role of athletes, right? Look, opposition seems to think that sports here is done merely for sport's sake. And we have to argue here that this is a lie. That the international sporting arena was always meant to be an arena of war without guns. I.e., it is rife with political expression, as is seen when people start arguing about how in Qatar there are human rights violations. There are human rights violations happening with the Beijing Olympics and all the rest. We do not think there is any harm of having simply one more platform in society, one more platform of people who are probably not really interested in politics usually, but are more willing to follow sports to actually begin to recognize the kinds of ills that are happening all around the world. We also think it was meant to be about good sportsmanship. It's also meant to be about the recognition of the kinds of different cultures and practices of everyone around the world. We think this is something that was sports in the Olympics spirit was supposed to be meant to be about gelling people in society and from different cultures altogether. We think that they harm this and they completely prevent this when you say that anything that is controversial is not allowed to be expressed. Anything that is an inherent part of my identity as a person cannot be expressed because somehow I might force someone into I might force someone to going into Christian evangelism or something like that. We don't think that's true. We think that even if you want to propagate your kinds of views and your kinds of perspectives within society, that is not an illegitimate view to have, especially when the world today is trying to move towards more abilities for people to express religious freedoms all over society, everywhere. So we're moving on to rebuttals, right? And this is where ops only harm was really about the fairness of public discourse. Two harms here. They said, firstly, governments may force you to say certain things that you didn't want to say. Secondly, minorities are not allowed to express themselves. So look, let's go on to let's talk about the first one first. Look, even if you're we don't think it's true, first and foremost, that governments act like North Korea all the time and force you to say things that you don't really want to say. We do think that us Singaporeans, just because you represent a country does not represent you represent the incumbent government's every view and perspective. You could be a Singaporean and be a proud Singaporean and still vote for the opposition, guys. We don't think that just because you represent a country, you have to agree, where patriotism just means agreeing agreeing with everything. But even if governments do like have some sort of coercion to force you to say something or other, we don't think that's an illegitimate expression of either, right? We think that if that is a country's views that you are propagating, that country has every right to speak itself through you as your mouthpiece. We don't think there's anything wrong with that. But then they wanted to talk about how minorities are not allowed. I think that there's other ones who are like, look, we think first and foremost it's a problem with media coverage. If I don't know, people from other countries are not allowed to speak out within the media, that's a problem with airtime. We don't think that can be really solved when you censor people from the very beginning from making any sort of expression at all.
Thank you, Patrick, please.
Two extensions from site closing government today, right? Firstly, we're going to talk about how we further politicize sports and it's not necessarily a good thing. But secondly, let's talk about how our proposal better protects the stakeholders in today's debate, which are twofold. Number one, the athletes themselves, and number two, the organizations that they're representing. But before that, rebuttals, right? I'm sure the Greek who founded Olympics will be rolling in their graves when they hear Natalie talking about how the purpose of international sporting arena is essentially a war without guns, right? We believe that sporting events, as cliche as it sounds, has always been about peace and understanding. But recognize this, while site-closing opposition truly believe in the form of public discourse to represent these minorities, our idea is that we don't believe that athletes and essentially sports is the best platform for you to actually do so, because more often than not we see people antagonizing athletes based on what they believe in. The fact that Hussein Abdullah was already antagonized because he represents the minority shows that the people who are actually watching the sports themselves are in fact a very hostile environment, right? Means that these are the people who these are the people you have to understand they are not exactly rational enough to actually engage in this form of public good, healthy discourse that you want to talk about. More often than not, people will use it as a form of attacking the athletes. People will view it as a form of, oh, hey, this is no longer an athlete who plays football. This is an athlete who supports, for example, Gaza. This will be used to actually gain leverage and attack attack this form of athletes in essentially like discrediting them and in the worst aspect, right, actually politicizing the whole matter and causing more harm to that. Second rebuttal, right, on how she talked about how we have to mobilize minorities within society. But you have to understand this, right? Minorities' rights are better off protected in other things, other events that are not sports, right? We already have lobby groups who are actively fighting for the rights of these minorities. We already have the governments who are actually working hand in hand with non-governmental organizations to bring more awareness to the matter at hand. But essentially what you're doing is when you have these athletes themselves represent themselves and proclaim their views which may not be in line with what the public thinks, you essentially antagonize them and you paint this image that they are people who are very much radical, right? You further allow the media to come into play and portray them out of context, which is essentially what happens to a lot of athletes, right? Whatever comments they make will be viewed as a tool for the public to actually make fun of them and actually derail and diminish their cause, right? We believe that it's very harmful for them. But then site opening government essentially has one thing, right? They want to extend on the idea of expression. They already say, since athletes are already allowed to express themselves in things like social media and Twitter, why not allow them to do so? You have to understand why my POI earlier in this debate was very important and has not gone unanswered until now, right? Is there a real difference between your personal life and your professional life? They simply brush it off. But here is what it says, right? Because when DPM comes out and tell you that, oh, hey, we already have celebrities and politicians expressing their view, you have to understand that these are people who are representing no one but themselves. These are all individual views on whether or not they are going to, if there's going to be any backlash, they are the ones that are going to take it full height on, right? But the fact that you are representing a country or a sporting organization means that any form of discourse towards you, any form of backlash will be directed towards the sports in general and towards the organization that you're responding. We don't see how is that fair for the sporting organization, especially when they have no idea what these athletes are going to say. We believe that in the long run it will jeopardize the athlete because it will discredit them, but in the long run it will also jeopardize organization that you are representing, right? Because we believe that this form of expression should always be distinguished when you have a personal and professional life, right? Just as how, like, you can always have personal views and portray yourself, but when you are in work, for example, you have to always represent and be professional, and this form of professionalism is what sporting is about, right? It's always this form of self-regulation and self-discipline that the sports is trying to portray. We don't see how that is going in line. But before I move on to my substantive, I'll go with closing.
Will we force feed a Muslim soccer player passing during the World Cup then?
No, that is a completely different idea, because this is purely about political and religious expression and not blocking your freedom of religion, right, at the end of the day. Because you have to understand, while we allow you to have fasting and those kind of things, we don't, the idea that we are talking about, something that's very regrettable, because site opening government never truly characterized, is the expression of it. For example, you kneeling down after a takeoff and pray to Jesus, or for example, you showing a neo-Nazi sign, right? These are the very things that you have to understand is problematic. Let's move on to my substantive on how you politicize sports. The first substantive, we talk about ambassadorship, right? Where you have to understand that now, when you allow this proposal to go through, you already distinguish whether or not that is a personal view or you're representing a certain body, right? We believe that now sporting arena is nothing but a parade of different beliefs, right? I.e., you are there not to actually play sports, you are there to act as ambassador to represent a certain belief. So now I'm going there no longer as a rugby player, I'm going there as a rugby player who's supporting, for example, communism, a rugby player who's supporting a certain cult within a certain religion. These are the things that will happen when you allow them to politicize sports further, because it will you will allow this form of identification based on your ideology, the athlete's ideology, and not their performance in the particular sports itself. So now you allow this form of politicizing to happen, because now you allow, for example, organizations who are bigger to actually buy these athletes to portray their beliefs. You allow them to actually use them as a tool, use them as puppets to forward the cause, and we believe that that's essentially very damaging to the sports itself. Because you have to understand, when if your problem is about awareness and bringing the rights right, we believe that there are other arenas and not sports, because they have not truly characterized us. Why are they allowing this to happen in sports? You have to understand that when it comes to sports, you cannot allow it to go politicized further. When you represent a brand, you're representing something that is already deemed as commercialized, but when you're representing something as controversial as a religion or your political views itself, it will be viewed as something that can that is already polarizing public, and we believe that the discourse that it creates will be more harmful, right? But secondly, let's talk about how we protect the stakeholders, right? Because you have to understand the nature of religious and political expressions that we are talking about here, something that both sides have actually failed to characterize on. You have to understand that these are more often than not things that are very much sensitive. They are no longer things that are personal. For example, me thanking my mother after a game. They are talking about things like whether or not I believe in only a single monotheology, right? Whether or not there's only a single God existing. And you have to understand that these views are portrayed to a wide spectrum of audiences. You are showing it to people who are perhaps controversial, conservative. You are showing it to people who are perhaps liberal. The fact that you put them into a public sphere and everyone can access the information, views that there is a very tangible harm, because you can further divide the nation through what you are doing, right? We believe it's very dangerous because these religion expressions are sensitive. Number one, you hurt the athletes because now you discredit them, as I've already shown you earlier, because more often than not, things will be taken out of context and actually portray them in a bad light to suit what the main narrative of the government wants. We believe that it's very harmful, right? But secondly, you also cause damage to the organizations, because now they'll be viewed as supporting a certain cause which they have not consented to. You allow people, for example, a Tibetan player to actually forward the cause when essentially that's not what they're trying to do. You're essentially putting the whole sporting arena in jeopardy, because now you're allowing external forces to attack them based on, not by performance, but based on their ideologies. We are proud to oppose.
Thank you. Now we have
The problem with the entire side today is that they seem to think that athletes are just puppets and robots who do nothing but run, swim, or what is required of them. They forget to understand that these athletes playing there are as humans as you and me, have identities and emotions just as you and me, and should have the right to express this opinion just like you and me. But more than that, before, let's see what this debate was about. Firstly, the closing government tried to tell you that how can we not separate these personal opinions from the identity of these athletes, and I would be expanding on that, and this would include their problems with exactly what is being expressed, and would it really kill the athletes if they decide to do this, to commit something personal in their opinion. Secondly, what exactly is the role of athletes in our world today, and what exactly do we expect from them? Now, going on to the first thing, why can't we separate these people from their individual opinions? Now, first we have to understand that these opinions are highly internalized. No, thank you, ma'am. Highly internalized and have become part of their identity to the extent that not allowing them to express these things in a most casual scenario, even when they are at their performing's best, is simply repressing them as human beings. And we do not make this distinction in any sort of public sphere either. Like things like we are allowed to wear our ethnic clothes in our offices, we are allowed to pray before an examination. We don't see that how the professional life of an athlete is any different from any other sort of professional life we seem to lead. But there they came up to tell us and gave us a mischaracterization of what exactly is being expressed. They think that only waving Nazi signs is an expression of personal identity. Natalie tried to take them down on this, but they didn't respond to this, that no, even casual things like saying thank God, fasting during Ramzan, yes, fasting during Ramzan is an expression of your religion and political identity. Now, it's the simple fact that they cannot understand that how this is even an expression shows that we see this as them part of being humans. Them expressing themselves religiously and politically is part of them being human. So what exactly happens when in their scenario we deny them this right? Firstly, we give this illusion that certain group of people, certain minorities and certain identities do not exist in the world at all, simply because nobody in the public domain seems to make a casual reference to it. No one seems to make a cross, or nobody seems to say thank you to their God. More than that, it's important for the people involved, and they represses the people, as I said before, because simply an important part of their identity is now being forcefully suppressed. Thirdly, it distances people from the athlete. People who have multifaceted identities no longer, in a moment, ma'am, no longer seem to think that they're athletes, that the idols that they tend to follow are also athletes as well. Yes, ma'am.
If a sport arena is a war without gun, the criteria that nation use to choose representatives is no longer based on your ability to play that sport, but how expressive and how persuasive and how representative you are. How is it not harmful to quality of sport?
First, we are not making it compulsory for everyone to express. Secondly, we are not expressing them to we are not forcing them to express themselves. Secondly, we don't think that these things are mutually exclusive, that people can play while express themselves either. It's not a choice between one or the other. We can simply choose the best athletes who seem to agree, but as I will show you later, that is not what exactly is happening. But more than that, no, thank you, ma'am. Now here they brought us to this attention that because the athletes choose to express themselves, they'll be mobbed by the fans in total because they choose to express themselves as a particular situation. Firstly, we must understand that this still must remain the choice of the athlete, whether he chooses to express himself or not, given the surroundings that he finds himself in. They are nobody to tell them preemptively that we are doing this for you. They cannot make babies out of these athletes. Secondly, we think that this is not really the case. People are rational enough to not only understand that athletes are more than just their religious expressions, there are also a lot of other choices in this world and choose to support them that. But thirdly, the main problem is that if an athlete is being mobbed because of his religious expression, then ladies and gentlemen, there's a deeper problem in your society that needs to be solved through deeper means of countering racism, countering religious discrimination, not simply forcing and hiding these people under the carpet because they might stir up something. What happens in this situation? Just because we think that a minority is problematic, we simply do not allow them to express at all. This is harmful for one, the minority itself. Secondly, for the people who now in our situation have a chance to see these communities being normalized, no longer being expressed at all. Not only you suppress the minorities, you do not even give the majority the chance to understand and accept them. Secondly, now moving on to my second question, that what is the role of athletes? Here we see them idols, here we see them as expressions. So we must also understand, thank you sir, we also must understand that we must see them as a total human being. In their situation where you simply make this athlete a person who runs, who just simply does the physical action, distances him from his fans and makes him less of an idol. We think that people have absolute right to choose who they choose to support or oppose based on decisions made in private life. Things like whether they are abusing drugs or not, things like their religious expression. Now the problem here with this is that they seem to believe that if we make our policy legitimate, this is all that would happen. Firstly, no. Sports take more things into account than that, including the sporting actions themselves. We are not making them simply a mode of expression, because ultimately they are still playing. If the expression happens to be a part of it, we see no problem with it. But what they think that the governments will now simply choose people who best support their cause. Firstly, no, because no government is as totalitarian as that, and oppositions within the country also exist, including on religious and political issues. If the athlete chooses to identify with one of these groups, that's perfectly fine. But secondly, if your government is exactly that totalitarian that they would simply kill you or never send you to a sporting event again because you choose to express yourself, then we think that international exposure of these groups become even more important, because in their situation, you suppress these people into silence, and this affects them personally, this affects the normalization of their community, this affects the country as a whole, and therefore I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank you. To close the debate, Alison.
Three issues that was discussed on today's debate, right? First issue is athletes' freedom of speech absolute. Second issue is what is the exact role of the athlete? And third issue is, will the spirit of the sport be affected? Three rebuttals I'd like to present to the floor, right? Firstly, I want to address on how the freedom of speech of athletes should not be oppressed, right? Our first response is that we have already told you that, do you agree on differences with personal and professional life, right? They did not address to that, and they brush it off again, because we have to concede to the fact, right? When a person makes a decision to express their views outside of a sporting event and when they are not working, we feel that it is okay, right? Because we feel that the environment of this sporting event is not conducive as a platform to express your views because of the tangible harms, right? Talking about tangible harms, my second rebuttal about what OG and member of government, tangible harms that they have talked about in their speech, right? They concede to the fact that there is harms. Sit down. There is harms when they express these views, right? So what are the tangible harms, right? OG said that it is okay if it doesn't affect the sport. We have to concede to the fact there are situations when their views actually affect the sport, which is the issues that they talk about the NFL and about the inequality of expression views. We feel that the sports is affected, but they say if it's okay if it doesn't, right? Second responses, right? They say that discourse happens and government feel that if the athlete's expression of political or religion is extreme, then these athletes can seek refuge in other country, right? Which was not addressed. This is also another tangible harm the opening government has stated out, right? So they already concede to the fact there is a very big tangible harms in their case and say that they still want to go on with it, right? No, thank you. Third responses as they say is there is a law and check and balance if these athletes were to express their views. Exactly, there is harms in expressing these views. That's why the check and balance comes into place. Because if you do not let them express their views, right, we would have avoided all these things to happen in the first place, right? Third issue I like to talk about is how they're drawing the parallel between politicians and celebrities comparing to athletes, right? Side closing government have
have already stated to you, right, why is politicians, celebrities different from athletes? Because you have to understand, politicians and celebrities are representing themselves, right?
Sure.
Whereas athletes, when they go into the arena, they are working, they have to be professional in it, right? Sit down, I'll take you later, right? How can you draw the parallel when politicians and celebrities present themselves, whereas athletes, they represent a nation or they represent a sporting organization? And that's why we feel that there's a problem when you draw a parallel like this, right? Fourth issue I'd like to talk about is that how it does not affect the spirit of the game, but then it is not their job to spread this extremist view. Because she said that it does not affect the spirit of the game when these people are expressing, when these athletes are expressing their extremist view or not, right? We feel that, it is not their job. Exactly, it is not their job to express this view, right? Because we feel that it's a very unconducive arena and it is not their role to do so when they are working, right? Because they said that all these people these people viewing these sports will have the rational capacity to handle these extremist views, right? If they have the rational capacity to handle this view, then why the NFL case came out in the first place? This shows that there are people who are very, very irrational in handling this case in the first place, right? I'll take you later, right? So this is the issues that they brought up already show the tangible harms, right? And how it actually affects the spirit of the sport in the first place. And they talk about how their job is not to spread ideologies, but their job is to play sports. Exactly, we agree, and that you are agreeing with us, right? Fifth issue that they talk about how, yes.
We think politicians represent parties and celebrities represent companies, and these athletes don't necessarily only want to win it for the country, but eventually they want to win it for family, and that's why we see them thanking God and the family. And secondly, the whole extension from CEO doesn't stand because we are not actively pushing for these people to voice out their expression, only supporting them if they want to.
Okay. You talk about how these politicians representing a political party, right? Exactly. The job of these politicians is to express their political views. That's why this is the job of the politician. It's their right to express these political views because it is in the nature of their job, right? Whereas celebrities, they're taking ambassadorships to support their own views. Whereas athletes, when they're at work, this is a different platform. We cannot draw parallel to this, right? Okay. Fifth, to talk about how we are hampering discourse, right? Both sides of the government has to tell us why discourse in media is not enough, that you need the athlete to create discourse, and by taking advantage of the international sporting arena to create discourse, right? Because side government never characterize why discourse is not enough in the media, and that we have to use the athletes to do so, right? Our second response is that how they talk about how these athletes are already posting in social media, right? So what is wrong by expressing what they're posting in social media in a sporting event? We feel that there is again the line of professionalism and personal life, right? Because when you are posting in social media, you are representing yourself. This is very personal. Whereas you go out, you are representing someone else, right? Now I'd like to move on. Thank you. Let's move on to how athletes are robots and puppets, right? And then we have to understand that they are human and that they have an identity. So when circumstances approach, these people as a person itself can express, right? Because you have to understand the conduciveness and the role of the athletes in the first place, right? Because side closing government never actually explain why this environment is very conducive in the first place, right? Because we have to concede to the fact that sporting events itself is for people to play sports and for peace, right? Because when you create a discourse, right, peace does not exist anymore. Because we have to understand that the circumstances is not conducive. Seventhly, they talk about how fasting while playing sports is an issue, right? Because we tell you that it's not an issue because fasting is already allowed in status quo, because we are not oppressing the fact that they believe in certain religion, right? We just feel that it is unconducive for them to express it publicly and verbally where it could create negative discourse, right? Last issue I have to talk about how the choices that they say, because we have to understand to a certain extent, right? Choices athletes make, but they said how decisions on private life, closing government said that the decisions on private life is up to them. Exactly, the decisions on private life are up to them, but you cannot express that if this negative discourse were to happen, right? Because side closing government has told you the tangible harms, how parties can use these athletes as a puppet, right? And we talk about how it already, how Patrick already talked to you about, especially explained to you how it misrepresents certain parties, and for that we are very happy to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please cross the house and exit the room. I'll call you back momentarily.